So one of the things that I realized immediately, I was told you do not talk to strangers.
Wow.
And that was the lesson that began on the plane.
Mm.
Now, this blew my mind because I grew up even in the city where everybody knew that's Luther's granddaughter.
Wow.
But this was no, you do not talk to strangers.
Mm.
You don't go to people's houses. You do not cross the street without looking. You do not just accept what people give to you. And in fact, you do not say anything. So the first
Wow.
physical marker of things I'd lost was the freedom to just be outside and
Wow.
have a sense of well being.
Mm. I'm Joey Yongzhen Liu, educator, researcher, storyteller, and coach. And this is Everyone Needs a Story for the Campfire. This podcast brings you impactful stories each week, drawn from my guests' lived experiences. You will gain inspiration, insight, new perspectives, and hopefully a sense of familiarity and belonging as we explore the themes that make us all at once uniquely individual, yet collectively human. This week, I sit down with masterful storyteller, educator, and researcher, Charlotte Achieng-Evensen. Charlotte transports us into her very personal Coming to America story, where she explores the theme of loss of the familiar, aspects of her identity, and even a sense of freedom. Her second story explores her journey through grieving and the ways that she moved through that grief to peace and joy, a story of resilience. Okay, well, welcome to the campfire. My brilliant, beautiful sister, Dada, Charlotte Achieng-Evensen. It is an honor to have you here. Thank you for making time to come to the campfire and share your stories.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. I'm nervous excited, but I'm glad. I think
Nervous-sighted.
this has been, yes, I'm nervous excited. And I also think this has been in the making for a very long time. It's an
Oh,
intentional
thank you
space.
for honoring that. Ooh, thank you for speaking, just putting that over this time together. That's beautiful.
Hmm.
And I want to
Yeah.
bring you into the podcast and what I'm calling the campfire, right? The campfire I'm pitching for these stories
Hmm.
to be shared with one another. But I want to bring you in with a story. It's the origin story of our friendship. So I'm going to take you back a few years when
Uh-huh.
you were invited to give a talk at a class that I was taking in the PhD program that I was in at the time. And you came in and you were a brilliant storyteller, orator, and gave this powerful, moving talk. You walked us through your research process, but it was effortless, right? We went on the journey with you. I remember being inspired. I remember being impressed. And in the course of your talk, I had formulated like one specific question that I wanted to ask you. You had an open Q&A. I don't think I asked the question during the open Q&A. I remember approaching you at the end of the talk, walking up to you, and I had one specific question, and you gave me one specific answer. And I said, thank you. And I was ready to be on my way. I don't remember
You
what the
were.
question was for the life of me. I was ready to be on my way. And you're like, wait, hold up. Let's exchange information. Continue the chat
Yes.
over coffee. And I was like, sure. And we exchanged phone numbers. But in my mind, I'm like, this powerful speaker, researcher lady, she's not going to have time for me. I'm just a second year PhD student. Like, it's just formalities. I'm never going to hear from this girl again. So I went on my way, never expecting to hear from you. And I don't remember if you reached out. I can't ever remember if you reached out. But you say you did reach out.
I
You
did.
reached out to me. You said you
Yes.
reached out, and apparently I ghosted you. I don't know what's up with that. I think that
It was
you
there was
you
silence.
it was silence on the other end. I'm so
Hmm.
sorry.
Hmm.
And I think there was actually multiple times. I think my advisor, who had been your advisor when you were in the program, had tried to set us up, and there was a wall of resistance in me. And all I can say about that is that internally I had this narrative that wasn't serving me. That maybe I just don't make friends. It was a very kind of neurodivergent. You don't make friends, right? Not even a you can't make friends or you should try to make friends. It was just a you don't make friends. It's not part of my paradigm. So I had the wall up, and it was probably over a year later. You were very patient. You were also very persistent. And over a year later, we connected at a research conference. And then it
We
was like
did.
insta friends. It was like one night we were just keeking over drinks, and it felt like we'd known each other our whole life. Time just sort of warped into, I don't know how many hours passed, but we definitely felt like we were long lost sisters and friends. And I said out loud at one point, "What took us so long to be friends?" And you said, "I don't know. I've been waiting." I remember there was an energy behind that. "I don't know. I've been
There
waiting
was an
on you."
energy and some attitude too, actually.
And I actually, yes, and I received it. I was like, I remember it was sort of like a wash of awareness breaking into my bubble of oblivion, and it was all of a sudden, all at once, I kind of realized, like, girl, you get your head out of the sand. Like, there's been people waiting on you, like beautiful human beings waiting to connect with you, and you're just like, we're not open to receive the blessings, and that is what you've been ever since. You've been such a blessing in my life, so I'm so grateful for your patience, and I'm so grateful for the circumstances that eventually brought us together. But you have definitely been such a big sister to me. You've been a mentor to me through my own process, my journey with research and earning my PhD. But beyond that, you've just been somebody who gets me, who protects me, who's always there for me. I call you Dada in Swahili, which means sister, and that's
Yes.
exactly what you embody to my life. So it is an honor to have you here at the campfire to share your stories. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I want to let you know something that the origin
Okay.
story began before that, actually.
Oh,
Before you set foot into the program, our mutual friend, and we'll bring him into the room, Paolo, could not stop talking about you.
Paulo.
And he
Paulo
could
will be
not
on the
stop.
show.
Yes, so Paolo
Oh,
could not stop
Paulo.
talking about you and how much love and respect he had for you, and how much he really was inspired by your spirit and how you were making your way into the world. And the thing
Mm,
that he wanted the most for you to do was to come into that space and then to be able to be in that space. So I already knew
wow.
you were coming, and I was
Wow.
working to prepare a space for you in a place that was not always friendly. And so when I met
Oof.
you, the origin is that that groundwork had already been laid,
Mm,
and you presented as exactly who you were.
mm,
And so there was a genuineness to it, which is why I could be patient, because I
mm,
understand what it is to live in this world, in
mm,
places that have harmed us, and the time that it takes to wait. And waiting
mm.
then doesn't become a burden, it's just part of the process. And
Wow.
so our origin story goes back before we were even physically in the same space.
Mm. Charlotte, I'm humbled hearing that. And I'm also laughing a little bit on the inside because when I first considered what to say about your preparation, I really wanted to talk about how our origin story embodies a different paradigm than what most people are
Hmm.
used to.
Yes.
Something you coined the term collective peoples paradigms to
Hmm.
talk about not only indigenous people, but people of the global south, the global majority, who live in a value system that centers around community and collective care, right? Which is different than the modern Western paradigm of individualism and competition. And I think I maybe brought my introduction of you kind of down to ground level, like elementary
Uh-huh,
level, a
uh-huh.
little bit for our listeners. But you're here at the campfire, so we're gonna go there. We're gonna go there, and it's humbling to know
Yes.
that. Um, Yes, even this connection, right? Thank you for keeping us grounded in that authenticity, right? But I'm so grateful to you. I'm so grateful to Paulo. I'm just blessed beyond measure to be making our way. You said this phrase, making our way as genuinely as we can in what often feels like systems that are too big for us, not shaped for us, not designed for us. And even, I would say, starting this podcast and reaching whoever it reaches, I don't know, but I think that more than ever we're in times where more and more people are seeking belonging outside of what they've known for a really long time, and maybe trying to get back to remembering
Hmm.
communities and cultures and spaces that are better for them, that are more
Yeah,
real
I
for them.
love that. We are working on that paper called Remembering. So I think that is a
Mm-hmm.
theme that's being carried through.
Definitely. And I think, will you talk a little bit more about it through your
I
stories or at the
will.
end of the
I
show?
will.
Perfect.
Yes,
Okay. Are you ready to get started? You've prepared two
I am
stories for us.
ready. I have prepared two
Beautiful.
stories. They're punctuated by poetry, if that is okay.
Mm, it's more than okay. Can't wait to hear
Yeah.
it. So let me
And in
introduce your
fact,
first story. Yes.
mhm, I was going to say, in fact, the poems actually structure and lay the groundwork for the things that I've learned. And so I bring
Mm.
those in too.
And yes, I should introduce that you're not only a researcher and storyteller and brilliant orator, but also an amazing poet. So thank you for bringing your poems along with you. It couldn't be any other way. Um, and now we'll get into the first story if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Beautiful. This first story is going to tie into the theme of loss that our guest Annabelle introduced to us last episode. She talked about loss, about losing different versions of herself as she's grown and matured, and the grieving process that entailed. And you're bringing a story to the campfire around loss in a similar vein of losing aspects of your identity in the process of coming to the US and losing all that was familiar to you. And if you're
Hmm.
ready, the stage is all yours.
So I'm going to begin with this poem called Memory. Memory. It came back. The memory, achingly simple, initiated by a slideshow of Africa. Maybe it was the darkness of the faces, midnight black. Sometimes so dark the camera couldn't capture the lively reflections. Maybe it was the vivid brilliance of colors found only in Africa. Black children in bright clothes, red on black, yellow on black, royal blue on black, contrasts created by a running blur across red dirt roads, with lush or even sparse green, sometimes brown plants. That was me, my memory shouts. That was me. I was the little girl with a wide smile, big eyes, and a solemn, noble pride. I was that child. I was the one who was precocious, charming, who gave freely to the pleasures of life, who cried heavily in the howling of the night, who found delight in the simplest of tasks. I was she who removed her grandfather's shoes, who washed his feet and dried them and massaged them. I was that child. Running, sliding, skidding upon burgundy hills, orange mountainsides, seated upon a piece of cardboard. We called it African sledding. I was that child who imagined greater possibility, whose life held such promise of an untamed wildness. I was that child. My memory sings of African words, and the bitter tears crawl down my face, my black face. My memory is trembling with shame and emotion, lost pride. I was that child running barefoot, sandals left miles behind. I was that child who was blessed by the African heat, washed clean by its torrential rains, baptized in the rawness of that incomparable land. I was that child whose very blood flowed with vitality, the purity of home. Generations of generations shaped me into who I was. I was that child in a white dress, running with bare feet singed by red dust of unpaved roads. And as this memory remains, so shall I stay that child of Africa.
Oh, Dada, that was beautiful.
Thank you. I was 8, maybe 9 or 10 years old. I think I've said this to you before, but I have a tenuous connection with time. Time for me, I don't experience it as linear. I experience it as moments that are maybe circular, and they shape and they feed into each other. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes somebody will ask me the question, give me this chronological story, and I can't because that's not how time works in my DNA. It is about the relationships of the moment. So I was 8, maybe 9, and I got the news finally that I was going to be coming to the United States of America. I'm coming to America, and I was going to be living with my mom because up until that point, I was living with my kakimeka, my kaki, my grandfather. I grew up in my grandfather's house. And I lived with him outside of Nairobi in Athi River. So I went to school at Athi Primary. And then when it was time for holidays, we were in the village because we all have a home in Shago in the village. And then I would go where my grandmother, my Dani, was taking care of the lands. So this was the rhythm of life. And it's important to note that I was the youngest child in the house. At that time, I was the only one, and I was a daughter. All of these things are pertinent. So growing up in my
Mm-hmm.
grandfather's house with all of my uncles and the cousins that come in and out and the fluidity of that lifestyle, I was now going to come to live in the United States. My mom had married an American and she'd moved. And my grandfather, I think, was about to retire and go back fully to the village. And so my paperwork apparently was sorted. I say apparently because, as with most US immigration cases, there were technicalities later. So I found myself on a flight, and I think it was around Christmas or Boxing Day. And I had never been on a flight before, I'd never been on a plane before. I'd been on buses, I'd been in cars, I'd been on a random donkey and maybe a cow, but had never actually been on a flight. So we went to the airport with all of the amazing things that were happening at the airport, all of the different languages, the cultures, the people. Loved it. I loved the airport. I still do to this day. We boarded a flight, and when we were on that flight, I think my eyes were just so big. I was so excited, and I was very annoying to my mom because I was a child with so much energy, so inquisitive, so curious. And some, I think, when I remember back somewhere in my brain, this did not seem to be a permanent thing. It was
Mm-hmm.
like I had been visiting my mom when she lived in Kenya. She lived properly in Nairobi. My uncles would come pick me up, transport me in the lorry to go visit her. Then I would go back to my grandfather's house to life as I knew it.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine I'm a child. We transitioned airports from Gatwick to Heathrow. And now we're on this flight. We're going to Los Angeles. But I didn't realize that because I just wasn't used to the idea of all these people going to the same place I might be going to. So at some point in time, being the energetic child that I was, I stood up and I was walking up and down the aisles because back in the day you could in
Mm-hmm.
airplanes, and I would ask people, "Oh, where are you going?" And they would say Los Angeles. And then I would ask the next people, "Where are you going?" And they'd be like Los Angeles. And I got so excited. I went back and I'm like, "Mom." And first of all, my mom is a very proper Kenyan mother, and she was like, "Can you stop being so loud? Sit down. Be quiet." Of course, we're all going to Los Angeles. Still blew my mind. So we landed in Los Angeles, and it was right around Christmas time. And my family at that time lived in Inglewood, which I say is a place where pretty much if you're a black person in LA, you lived at some point in your life, um, with all humor. And I remember we were driving around, and the place seemed so magical. Everyone had their lights out and it was twinkling, and there were all these proper lawns with fake snow, but I didn't know it was fake snow because I didn't understand the geography that we're really in high desert. And there were all these manicured snows and these giant Santa Clauses. And we didn't do Christmas like that in Kenya. It was all Father Christmas and we have treats and that's about it. And everything seemed so uniformed and so pristine and so magical, as if I were perhaps entering a movie. And so that was my entry into Los Angeles and into Inglewood. And soon thereafter, I realized that what I imagined to be magical and what I imagined to be um, twinkling and uniform and organized was this slow process of death of what I had known and who I had been and what I had experienced as a child growing up in Kenya, in Athi River, in Ugunja and Gotosimbo, which is my village. So one of the things that I realized immediately, I was told you do not talk to strangers. And that
Wow.
was the lesson that began on the plane. Now, this
Mm,
blew my mind because I grew up even in the city where everybody knew that's Luther's granddaughter. But this
wow.
was no, you do not talk to strangers. You don't go
Mm,
to people's houses. You do not cross the street without looking. You do not just accept what people give to you. And in fact, you do not say anything. So the first physical
wow.
marker of things I'd lost was the freedom to just be outside and have a
Wow.
sense of well being.
Mm,
Pretty soon, I was enrolled in school, and it was a public school because I think I might have been on a student visa. I'm not quite
mm,
sure, and I never asked. So I was in
mm,
a public school, interestingly enough, called Warren Lane Elementary School. It was on 7th and Arborvitae. Giant school, lots of kids. And it wasn't that I wasn't used to being in a giant public school because I went to Athi Primary. And it wasn't that I wasn't used to being with a lot of kids. But
mm,
what was different was that I was a child with a very, very thick accent
mhm.
because I had just come home from Kenya and I was now living in this new house, in this new place where you could not be
Mhm,
talking to other people. So I had to change the way that I talked so I would not be bullied and so
mhm.
that teachers could understand me. That was another physical marker. At this time, my
Oof.
mom decided that, some of the things like my hair care was too much because there were aunties around when I
Mhm.
grew up. And when I got there, I was not taking care of my hair the way that I should have been. So she shaved it. And so I was a dark skinned, deeply accented young girl who'd just come from Kenya. And by the way, the movie Roots, the series had just come out. So you can
Mm,
imagine what was happening in the playground. And I
yeah.
was an inquisitive child. I was a curious child. And so, as a curious child, I'd always been rather good in school. But because I had an English language learner designation, the school immediately put me back a grade.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so, even in the learning context, I was bored. So, I am telling this story and naming some of these physical markers because, in every which way, the world that I had known, be it
Yeah.
school, be it the relationships with outside, be it who I saw myself as, was absolutely shattered. And at that time, I had a little brother because I had a little brother who was born, and it was the first time that I was a big sister in the house with a child who was my sibling. And
Mhm.
so, without other aunties, without other sisters, without other uncles. And so I became the sole caretaker
Yeah.
of my brother, who I love dearly. But then again, that was a narrowing down of a world that had been so open and so
Right.
magical and so
Mm,
twinkling for me. And so
mhm,
imagine here I am, this kid who could no longer skip freely
mm,
because it wasn't safe outside, who
mhm.
couldn't really socialize because people did not understand my accent, who couldn't really feel free learning because the
Mm.
teachers assumed that I did not have access to language and therefore I didn't have access to knowledge. And so they put me in a learning context that far under challenged me.
Yeah.
And also, I didn't know my mom, I hadn't grown up with her. And so
Wow.
the wild, free, inquisitive, um, powerful child, that persona that I
Ooh,
had as a child that
yes.
I had imagined was seemed to be gone overnight. And so those
Wow.
twinkling lights and that snow and those manicured lawns, that was the last time I remember thinking that it was magical where
Mm-hmm.
I now was. And then I, of course, really missed my kaki. I
Mm-hmm.
cried whenever I would hear his voice.
Mm.
I was so sad. And my mom, not knowing what to do, just said that I was no longer allowed to talk to him on the phone.
Oh.
And therefore, that cut off all of my felt connection. So when I talk
Wow.
about the physical markers of existence, be it the land and the people and the experiences and the sense of being of who I
Mm.
was, I had to recraft that.
Wow.
So I began to escape into books and the mystery of books. And I also began to escape into words, but those words were internal for me because I
Mm.
couldn't share them out. I had no space,
Mm.
physical, emotional, in any way to share out
Mm.
my inner world. And it seemed like that inner world I could share out in the world of books. And so
Yes.
that's where I conceptualized of this idea. And I'm using the word conceptualize like I was 9 years old or 10 years old, being like, let me conceptualize. But
Yeah.
because now I can reflect back,
Yeah.
I thought about journey a lot. I thought about escape
Mm.
a lot. So I have this poem. I am on this journey, a pilgrim on her path to salvation. Along the road, many things I see, shaded trees glowing as golden sunlight kisses upturned leaves, quiet wind blowing as silvery moon paints spiny grass sleeves. I feel soft ground with its broken particles of earth drinking the heavy tread of my wandering step. I hear the silence around me echo, echo, words of experienced truth. I walk on in contented musing.
Mm. You wrote that as a child?
I wrote that as a teenager.
Mm.
So when
Beautiful.
I think about my immigration story, my parents quickly, or my father rather, realized that school was harmful and he moved me to a smaller school, a
Good.
Lutheran school where he was
Mm.
principal. And I encountered, I think, more freedom there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because he was also there, I'm not quite sure, but certainly because I could get lost in the processes of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm.
the adults had a more specific gaze on all of us children.
Mm-hmm.
But from the onset, I was very, very aware that I was an outsider and I was different.
Mm-hmm.
And this immigration story continued because I went back. I was sent back to Kenya at
Mm.
14. So a few years later, my we went back, and I am not quite sure why we went back. But we went back, and I remember being in a room with all of my uncles and my kaki and my mom.
Wow.
And the US had just decided that it was going to engage in the first Gulf War.
Mm.
And my mom was able to leave because my brother was an American citizen
Okay.
and I was not. So she left me there.
Wow.
And so what happened was that now I got to experience what happens when you've come back, you think is home.
Yeah.
What happened when I went back and I was 14? My language, both my tribal language, Luo, and
Mm-hmm.
my Swahili didn't flow quite as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt, and I also spoke with the American R's, as my cousins love to make fun of.
Yeah.
And the way that I conceptualized the world was not the same. I'd
Right.
been now acculturated in American systems.
Yeah.
And so I was a little too open and opinionated.
Mm.
I was a little too soft.
Mm.
And I was a little too, um, what's inflexible, maybe not inflexible, but a little not as routinized in the ways of life as when I'd left. And so
Yeah.
going back, I fully realized that, wait, this might be home, but this is not home. It is my
Yeah.
place of origin, but it is no longer the place where who I fully am
Mm.
resonates with how the space has been structured.
Yeah.
And I think at that time is when I started really to see the fullness of what I'd lost
Mm.
when I moved to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I think I began to realize that I did lose a sense of deep identity that
Mm.
I had did not know how to ground, and I didn't
Mm.
have the community to help ground me in that way. I was very isolated.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so that is my first story.
Wow. I'm sitting here with a story, and I want to I want to just comment first on your storytelling, because as a researcher, you're not just a storyteller, you offer the commentary along with the story. So every question I formed as the story was going, you would then answer it.
It's because I'm a teacher.
You're a teacher, you're a writer, you're a researcher. Every strand of it was a story, and it was the meta analysis of the story is so intricately woven. I wanted to ask, at what point did you realize that you were losing these identities? And by the end of the story, there it was,
Yeah.
the answer, when you returned home. But again, in this space, I will leave my stories internal. All I'll say is I connect to you in so many ways, and even though I know you so intimately, hearing the story from start to finish again, I'm just thinking like, wow, the power of stories. Because we come from such different cultures and such different geographic spaces, and yet hearing your story makes me feel less different
Mhm.
and less alone, even though I think a common theme in the story were those moments that felt so outside of belonging, so different, so othered, such an outsider. But when you tell the story, what a powerful way to connect to others who have similarities in their story. And for those who don't have a similar story, what a powerful instruction and exercise in empathy, and raising our awareness to know that this is a form of childhood that many people go through, even if their experiences are so different from yours. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that we'll transition now, since you did so much of the commentary already in your story. I think we're ready to transition, if you're ready, into your second story, because I think the story really, really stems from this first story, but goes a little bit deeper.
Mhm.
You mentioned in the first story that powerful bond and connection you had with your grandfather, your keiki. Is that how you
Kaki,
pronounce it? Kai,
kaki,
kaki,
hmm as in kaki maker, but
kaki,
kaki. Yeah,
kaki meka.
yeah.
And you will now share in this story. It's a story again of loss, but also of resiliency, because you went through a deeper loss and you had to journey and pass through to the other side. And so you'll be able to tell us through this story a little bit about how you discovered your own resiliency in this process of losing your grandfather.
Yeah, so I'll begin with the word journey and begin with this poem. This is called Journey 2. In this particular poem, I wrote this poem when I found out that my grandfather had died. And I
Mm.
was going to school. I was in Portland, Oregon. Um, I used to work in the library. And so, as a person who worked in the library, you would think that my job was to file books, that I really knew the
Mm.
Dewey Decimal System very well, that I was great at cataloging, that I was really good at linear, like attention to detail. Yeah, that was not my
Mm.
strength. Randy, who was the librarian, pretty soon discovered that my powers lay in other areas, as in when I was womaning the front desk of the library, so many people came into the library and there was so
Ah,
much traffic.
yes.
So my job, for the most part, was relegated to the periodicals and taking care of the first
Mm-hmm.
floor and helping to make sure people were doing well, because as you can tell, I was very talkative and I was very curious about other people's story, and that just happened. Um, and so
Yes.
it was a particularly rainy day in Portland. That's not a surprise. And I was at the front desk. It was quiet. In the library, it was relatively early in the morning. And someone came into the library and said, "Is Charlotte here?" And I remember Randy saying, "Yeah, she is. Let me just grab her. She's in the media center." And they said this letter is for her. And I thought to myself, I came out and I received the letter and I said, "Somebody wrote me a letter? What?" And I turned
Mm-hmm.
the letter aside and it was from the church that my parents attended. So I was like,
Mm.
this is interesting. One of the old ladies in the church sent me a letter. How sweet. She's wondering how I'm doing in
Mm.
college. I opened the letter and it had a card in it and it said, "I'm so sorry to hear that your mother's father has died."
Mm.
And
Mm.
I had to read it again. And I remember asking Randy, "What does this mean?"
Mm.
And I mean, I'm getting teary about this. So excuse me. So Randy said, looked at it, and then he looked at me and he said, "I think this letter says that your grandfather has died." And then he said to me, "Would you like to use the phone?" And
Mm.
in my brain, I remember this moment and I remember thinking, like, I that can't be true. My parents would have told me. So I called
Mm.
home and we had no cell phones back in the day. I
Right.
called home and I asked, my dad picked up the phone and my dad likes to say, "What's happening, youngster?" And I
Mm.
said, "I just received a letter from one of the prayer ladies at church, and she says she's sorry to hear that Kaki died." And he said, "Let me give the phone to your mom." And
Oh,
so he gave the phone to mom, and mom said, "Yeah, my father died." And I was quiet.
yeah.
And then my dad got on the phone and said, "Well, we didn't want to worry you. You're at school."
Oh,
And I said, "Okay." And I hung up the phone. This
yeah.
poem is called Journey 2. Move along this road gently. Shuffle your feet, sink them in the grainy dirt, embalm in it their gnarled shape. Feel the fertile rapture of their encapsulation. Then know the suffering of a contented life. Then know the red and blue fire of who you are. Then know
Mm.
the open meadow of hope in living. In that moment, my world collapsed in itself, and I realized that I could never be the person who I was, that I had lost the person who had rooted me to a sense of love,
Yeah.
to a sense of hope. And I felt so alone. And the only thing
Yeah.
I could remember was my grandfather's words to me always of moving along step by step.
Mm.
And there were, I think, I don't even think I was upset um, in that moment, but I was disturbed because I didn't know what it would be to craft a new life um,
Mm.
without that person who always rooted it for me, even if I hadn't spoken
Yeah.
to him. And I didn't know, I knew certain things though. I'd promised my grandfather that I would finish school. So I was going to
Yeah.
do that. And
Yes.
I'd promised him that I would always be joyful because that was the thing that he would say to
Mm.
me when he would come home and I would wash his feet because, you know, Athi, where we lived in Athi was very dusty. And
Yes.
so it was that, and that's when I would talk. And I remembered that I learned to read on his lap before I was 3
Mm.
because he was always reading
Yeah.
all the newspapers. And I don't know
Yeah.
at what point I started reading, so much so that when I went to kindergarten, I got kicked out because I already knew how to read and I just wanted them to feed
Yeah.
me nyama choma, which is basically barbecued meat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And so those were the things that I could do. And then I knew that I would, to some extent, always live with this sense of being homesick.
Mm-hmm.
This, and I think homesick for me meant the identity of who I was, and maybe even
Mm-hmm.
the identity of who I was going to be, and the sense of
Mm-hmm.
belonging, and
Mm-hmm.
the knowledge of how to move forward.
Yes.
So I finished school, and I think that encapsulates a lot. It was one step after the
Mm-hmm.
next. Um, and then I traveled around the world for a while. I was teaching in other places for a while. And then I came back again because I had this promise from my grandfather that I would finish school. And when I
Yeah.
came back, I came into, decided to do a doctoral program. Originally, it
Right.
was going to be in comparative literature, and I was going to look at my
Mm-hmm.
Luo language and then um, study how it was passed on. But then I got lost traveling around the world for a while. So I fell in love with the profession of teaching and the very real
Yeah.
possibility and joy and hope and the learning, the idea of learning alongside students and how it taught me and the
Yes.
reciprocal nature of all of that. And so I ended up
Yeah.
deciding to do my dissertation or my doctoral program in the field of education. And our
Mm-hmm.
mutual advisor asked the question, which I later learned that she asked everybody. But I told her, I'm going to do write my dissertation on teaching. She said, but where are you in that? What? She said, where are you in that? And I said, I, where
Mm.
I was in that library in Portland, in Oregon, very much knowing that I
Mm.
lost a sense of who I was. And now she
Yeah.
was inviting me. I would say demanding, but she would say inviting. She was inviting me
Mm.
to go back and reconsider where I was and what that meant. Because in that question, I
Mm-hmm.
also heard, where are we? And I mean the collective.
Mm.
So, where are your
Mm-hmm.
ancestors in that? Where are your cousins in that?
Mm.
Where are your people in that? Charlotte, where are you in that?
Mm-hmm.
And then um, that whole process for me was about my grandfather and the promises we made and the
Mm.
hopes we'd had and the things we talk about. So, when I wrote my dissertation, this was the poem I dedicated to him. Actually, the whole process, and it's
Mm.
called Fokaki. Fokaki.
Mm.
I am sometimes homesick. Red roads and ochre dust washed by constant rains. Green foliage verdant with color, rich with hints of light and life. A cacophony of women calling, or chiding, or singing rhythmic, in cadence and out, always rhythmic. The sight of men sitting, talking, pondering, questioning motives and agreeing to disparage, to note, to celebrate. I miss home. The quiet acceptance of community poised to embrace. The echoing weight of tropical air full of elusive scents. Earth, spice, promise of better. What is better?
Mm,
I miss the wisdom of age and he who harbored it. Gentle, he explained to me truths and untruths. He spoke of circumstances I could never grasp. There on his life, he taught me to see, and when I could not, he taught me to listen.
mm,
He molded me to care for his sake, for God's sake. Old man, Mzee Kaki, I miss you.
mm, mm,
Age, I have arrived. I'm of age now, but what of it? My innocence is lost, my wisdom is not yet gained. I fall in solitude, a drop of rain unaccompanied. Torrential downpours, where have you
mm,
gone? Call me back to my roots of knowledge. Wrap me in kindness. Shroud me with love. I am indeed homesick.
mm. When you share these two poems, I hear the story bookended, right? And I'm thinking back to that first story that you wrote when you
Hmm.
first found the news, and it felt you had these symbols of fire. It felt like you were consumed with the grief and the confusion of what you'd lost,
Hmm.
and even how you found out about what you lost. It felt so broken from a chance to have ceremony or connection. It was just sort of
Hmm.
poured upon you and you had to move through it. And then hearing the second poem, it's clear that it honors your grandfather's legacy and your grandfather's, the promises you made your grandfather. So the wishes that your grandfather bestowed on you. To me, and you can reflect back to me if this is wrong, but to me, it feels like the wishes that your grandfather communicated to you when you were together in person became the guide for you through your grief until you could get to a place where you were speaking about joy and arriving back at home.
I think you picked that up so beautifully and so clearly, and I would agree with you. I think also I want to picture the guide really as the old man with a walking stick in the
Yeah.
village, walking with you.
Mm,
He laid down these footsteps in terms
mm,
of the wishes and the words, um,
mm.
and the cherishing and the tenderness and the
Wow.
care, so that
Wow.
when I was without him, I did
Yes.
still have those words in the midst
Wow.
of loss. From the
Mm,
time I arrived, I shared these two stories because they're connected. So from the
yes.
time I arrived and I felt this deep sense of loss, and in fact, there was loss, and
Yes.
this deep sense of isolation and loneliness, those wishes, those memories were
Mm,
still my guide. And they did help me to
wow.
have a sense of hope, a sense of resilience, because I was always walking towards something
Yes.
beyond myself.
Wow. Mm.
Mhm.
What I hear when you say that is a question to myself, and maybe I can pose this to myself and to all of us. What steps are we taking? What stories are we telling? What questions are we asking to those that we love and that we care about here in the present while we're alive, that we intend to stay with us after our physical bodies are gone? What I heard in that is that your grandfather crafted lessons for you, crafted connection points and guides to walk with you when he knew that he wouldn't be here any longer.
and he knew that I wouldn't be with him
Mhm. Mm.
because I imagine he always knew that there was a time when I would not be with him.
Mm. Mhm.
Yeah, I
And
didn't know it, but he did.
yeah. As is often the case with eldership, right? With someone who's
Right?
walked before us so many years and is now bringing up the younger ones. I think it's often the
Yeah, and
case.
somebody, I think so. And I think too, when people step into eldership, because you have to
Mhm.
step into it, when they put
Yes.
on that mantle
Yes.
and they're willing to listen, um, and learn alongside, and they
Yes.
have the wisdom, um, and the humility.
Mhm. Mhm.
I would have wanted more time with my grandfather, my kaki. I would have wanted him to ask him, Kaki, what lessons do you want me to learn?
Mm. Mhm.
Now I think I would have wanted to ask that, but then when I reflect through storytelling and through the work that I do, and through the things that I write, he answered those questions already.
Oof, that's so
Maybe
powerful.
not the way I want, right? Because I want the tangible, I
Tangible.
want it right here. I want to like
The
touch,
face to face,
taste,
yes.
smell. Yes, I want the
Mhm.
physical, but this is, this is beyond that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes. Thank you for walking us through that. I want to bring up one more moment in that second story, and ask about another elder who asked a question to you, right? A shared elder that you and I have.
Yes.
You mentioned this question she posed to you when you were selecting your dissertation research. If she had not asked that question, what do you think your journey would have looked like? Would you have found your way back to the moment in Portland when you received the news? Would you have sat with and reconciled with this homesickness that you've carried so long? Um, how would making your
Yes.
way look different?
So I have always written poetry. I've
Mm-hmm.
always written because these are active moments of
Mm-hmm.
reflection, active moments of moving through pain, active moments of being humbled, and
Mm-hmm.
active moments of observing. And
Yes.
so this homesickness, I have always wrestled with it. Um, the idea of how do I step into the world even though I constantly feel as if I do not belong.
Mm-hmm.
I've always wrestled with that.
Yeah.
I just did not know that I could do that in an academic space.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yes.
Actually, she asked this question, but for me,
Mm-hmm.
it allowed me to open up all of the layers that accompanied it that she didn't know. She knew what
Mm-hmm.
she was asking at this level, but I don't think she could have known all of the
Right.
generative worlds
Mm.
that accompanied and thoughts that accompanied
Mhm.
that question. Because when she asked, where are you in this? I didn't hear, where are you? As I said,
Yeah.
I
Yes.
heard, where are we?
We.
Because we, collective we. So I am
Beautiful.
not only myself. I am my
Yeah.
grandfather's granddaughter. And I would say I'm
Yes.
also my grandfather's daughter.
Yes.
I
Yes.
am my mother's daughter, but I'm also the daughters of my aunties.
Yes.
I am a mother to my cousins and my sister
Mhm. Mhm.
and my chosen ones, but I'm also
Mhm.
their sister.
Yes.
Right? So within
Mhm.
lives, all of these worlds of people and histories and memories and legacies who have been.
Yeah.
So it is not only a me, I am part of it, right? I certainly am an important part as they're an important part, but where are you becomes where are we? And so that
Mm.
is how I heard and I understood that question. And so I
Yes.
was on this journey, but I didn't know I could do it in an academic space, which is so structured, it's
Yeah.
so limited, but
Yeah.
also provides so much time to be able to
Yes.
delve into it in a way that's sustained and laser focused.
Right.
Mhm.
I am appreciating this answer so much. I mean, first of all, I think this entire episode, your entire presence here in your stories is just a love letter to third space children who have grown into these adults who are, we contain multitudes of relationships and positionalities and people and places and grapplings with how do we belong and how do we bring our complex narratives into spaces that feel so much more linear and boxed in than how we know that we exist, right? And how we know that we
Yeah,
exist in relationship to these collective entities and identities. So yes, this episode, sitting and talking with you, feels like a love letter to all of these third space folks who are making their way, who are journeying through these spaces. And also, you know, not everyone is in academia. Certainly it's a select few, but I think that that story speaks to this idea of these moments where we realize and give ourselves permission, where we are either invited in or we give ourselves permission to bring ourselves more fully in. So whether
hmm
that's at your job or in your relationships with people maybe of a different culture or a different paradigm than you, right? Whether it's in our whatever organizations or whatever systems we participate in, right? Just a reminder, how can we connect more deeply with ourselves and our truths and bring those truths into the spaces that we inhabit and that we participate in? So thank you for shining such a beautiful light on that with your words.
I have a closing poem that actually
Yes.
really helps me reflect on what you've just said. It's called Soul Deep.
Yes.
A soul deep question flutters out from my instructor's wisdom kissed lips. Who are you now, dear one?
Mm.
I know you're not exactly the person who left. So who are you now? I am the daughter of tears, born from the dust shorn banks of the Athi River, she who has lost her way between borderlands and barren escarpments, whose face
Mm.
recognizes not the acacia nor the baobab, whose voice cannot whisper the ancient songs carried along savanna plains. I cannot see into the far distance. My heart is silent. I am the triumph in sorrow, she who recognizes that time, like the spirits of our ancestors, pours out blessings which carve us into patterned beings. Segment by segment, we are creations tattooed into a bleeding land, the blood of hope, the blood of rebirth.
Mm.
I am the enemy arrow driven into the shadow of my forefather, watching even as my people turn away in defeat, their champion vanquished, only to live in the cautionary tale of heroism and of humility, the rock of Kitmikai. Who am I now? The time for rain has come and gone. I dwell in the season of drought. Fierce birds of prey have scavenged, and the graceful animals have moved on to more fertile ground. I am still here, the child reared to thrive, the daughter swallowing her unformed dream.
Mm. Thank you for sharing such a beautiful poetry, beautiful stories. You moved me to tears. I think I'm especially emotional as I sit here, and in the middle of my coming home story, and so much of what you said um, just hits me in my heart. And I'm here with my grandparents, so I can really, really, really relate. Um, so thank you. Still emotional apparently. But we're going to wrap up today's episode with you reflecting a little bit. You are a storyteller, you are a professor, you're an educator, you're a writer, your writing, even by way of your dissertation, has reached strangers across the globe. And I want you to reflect a little bit now on this theme of stories that reach. What does it mean to you
Mm.
for us to put our stories out into the world beyond just, the comfort of our intimate relationships, our friendships, and our family, but to really put our stories out there for strangers to connect with? What does it mean to you for our stories to reach?
I have a very tense relationship with stories that reach.
Yeah.
Um, what it means to me is first the building of a space of connection and allowing human beings to see themselves reflected. And that sounds
Mm-hmm.
very objective, so let me make it more
Mm-hmm.
personal. It means to me that I am that 8 or 9 year old who's being seen, because
Mm,
what I have experienced, the joys, the sorrows, the loneliness, the angst, the emptiness, someone else also experiences.
yes.
And perhaps in that experience, they can see that maybe we can walk together.
Yes.
It means that. At the
Yes.
same time, to put my story out in the world is a very, it feels very vulnerable. And
Yeah.
because of the experiences I've gone through, I am very self protective.
Yes.
And
Yes.
even as I am self protective, I do think that I am in this world to share in the mutuality of what it means to be a human being. And so I'm
Yes.
not by myself, so I can be self protective, but
Yeah.
also I'm a social creature. And so that's the tension that
Mm-hmm.
I talk about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sharing the stories, I think I'm vulnerable and I could be hurt and I could be judged and I could be found wanting and I could once
Yes.
again experience deep
Yes.
isolation and loneliness
Ooh.
and hate. And at the
Mm-hmm.
same
All of
time,
that.
I want someone to not experience that through
Yes.
reliving a shared experience. And maybe there can be healing. And even if it's
Yes.
just one person that's worthy, that's like worthy of, of living life. It gives meaning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you just put to words the conundrum of storytelling.
Hmm.
And this is a conundrum. This is a tension that I have
Hmm.
made sort of my life's work at this point. Um, and and I mean, you're calling me back into the memories in oral expressions in my storytelling course in the high school classroom, and how carefully we had to walk through these tensions because these were very, very vulnerable stories. And how do we make sure we take care of the trauma and the vulnerability? How do we protect ourselves? It is necessary to create environments of safety, right?
Hmm.
I have had to learn and craft because there's not so many textbooks out there on how to do this work, right?
No.
But you and I and many others, we are, like you mentioned at the beginning of the story, we have this in our DNA just a little bit, right?
Hmm.
We have
Hmm.
story. We come from oral cultures, oral histories. And so I'm just thank you for being so honest in putting words to that tension, because I think that if we're going to talk about sharing stories, we have to talk about the dangers of sharing stories, and we
Hmm.
have to talk about the preparation that each of us needs to do, our healing work, our own story work, right?
Yes.
Before it is even a possibility to share it, because then we access the power and the impact, because then we can put it out there as a an art form,
Hmm.
as an embodiment of our healing, as an embodiment of our processing, our internal work that we've done, right? The
Hmm.
stories we tell, that we have to tell ourselves, have to tell first, have to be the stories we tell ourselves. We have to be our own first audience, like you've shared so beautifully in your writing, in your poetry. And I think a lot of folks are missing that step. I just know that in my teaching work, a lot of us have to be reminded of the the need to do our own story work before we start sharing our stories. And it doesn't mean that once you go share your story, whether through whether on paper or on stage. It doesn't mean you're not going to feel vulnerable, but I promise you will have the roots to stand
Mm-hmm.
firm when you share your
Mm-hmm.
story, right?
It's
You'll
an
have the
ongoing work.
intention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the power. You tap into
The
our collective
power.
power. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been amazing.
Thank you,
It's been
Dada.
emotional.
It's been emotional. It has been emotional. Yes. Whew.
Uh, yes, thank you for taking us on that journey. I think journey is the word I'm really taking with me, the title of your poems, but it really was a journey. I hope that this episode goes out to whoever needs it, whoever can feel a little less alone, like you mentioned, when you share your stories. Maybe somebody else will feel a little less alone in their experience by hearing these stories today. It's been an absolute honor to have you here. You're always my mentor, my guide, my dada, my older sister, and my friend. So thank you for being here at the campfire. And I can't wait. Thank you to my audience too for being with us in these stories. And I can't wait to bring you some more stories next time with our next guest. But thank you, Charlotte, for being here today. Oh, hold up. Wait a minute.
Yes.
Please share with my audience where they can find your work and connect a little
Okay.
bit more with you.
Yes. And so I know we talked a little bit about this earlier. I'm very shy on social media, so it's hard to find
That's
me
okay.
there. But
That's
you
not our
can
only
find.
way into the world, contrary
I
to maybe
know. I mean,
public opinion.
contrary to public opinion, with our writing group, we have two books out. One of them is
Yes.
called Pedagogies of Witness.
Yes.
And we bring a collection of educators together there. So I was an editor on that project, and it's set up as vignettes that bring educators sharing different experiences and sort of moving through that, elevating student voice. So centering
Mm-hmm.
student voice. So that is a project that is recent. Another one is again with our writing book. It's called Frarian Echoes, and this book is about just sort of sitting together and sharing in dialogue generationally. We
Yes.
paired uh, elder scholars with younger scholars and practitioner. So there is that. And there's my dissertation, which one of these days might give birth to a book. But I love this
It will.
dissertation. I love this
Yes.
dissertation.
Me
It's called
too.
Young Urban Professional and Kenyan Conversations Surrounding Tribal Identity and Nationhood.
Yes.
And what I love
Yes.
about it are the stories that people share in
Mm-hmm.
it as well. I'm seeing a theme here.
What do you love,
This is
Charlotte?
I love stories and bringing people
So
together and cultivating hospitable spaces. Yes.
I think we
Yeah.
share that in common. I will drop the links to each of those three titles that you mentioned because your work is so important. You're such a beautiful writer, an amazing speaker too. So if anyone is so lucky to hear you speak, hopefully you're still continuing to be speaking your stories in person. But where geography is limited, the internet connects us all. So I'm really honored to be able to put these stories of yours out there to the internet, to whoever can find them, to hear them. Thank you again. Yes?
Thank you. There should be a tagline where geography is
Oh, which
limited,
part?
the internet connects us
The
all.
internet connects us.
Where geography is
Made it up on the
limited,
spot.
the
It's
internet
limited. The
connects us
internet.
all. Beautifully said.
I
I
love
love
you,
you,
Charlotte.
Dada.
Thank you for
Much
being here. I'm so
love,
tired.
candles, and all of the love
Thank
to
you.
your audience as well.
Thank you so much. I'm in awe of Charlotte's storytelling magic. If you want to hear more of her poetry, stories, and insights, make sure to check out her published works in the links below. Thank you for spending time with us at the campfire. I hope to see you here again in a couple of weeks, and I hope you're thinking about what stories you will bring next time you pull up a seat at a proverbial campfire.